Welcome to The Week in 60 Minutes from Spectator TV, the show that makes headlines around the world. Our interview with David Nabarro of the World Health Organization last week was raised in the House of Commons, reported in newspapers from New York to New Zealand, and even tweeted by Donald Trump. If you missed it, you can catch up on our YouTube channel. Tonight, I'll be speaking to pollsters, pundits, and a politician about the proliferation of lockdown rules in the UK, which over half of the population now find themselves in increased restrictions. We took a look at France, where President Macron has taken a stance against Islamic extremism. And we will finish with Brexit. Yes, it's still with us. What's the latest from Brussels? As ever, we'll take questions from the audience in the last 10 minutes or so. You can email them at SpectatorTV at spectator.co.uk. That's SpectatorTV at spectator.co.uk throughout the show. You can subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel for free. If you're already watching on YouTube, just tap the subscribe button in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. You'll then receive a notification whenever a new episode is aired. A special thanks to Charles Stanley for supporting this episode. Charles Stanley is one of the UK's leading wealth management firms and one of the oldest firms on the London Stock Exchange. So, to our first topic, local lockdowns. It's been another febrile week in British politics. Vast swathes of the country are in various shades of lockdown. Some regions are fighting to keep their medium risk status. Others are fighting to get into tier 3, that's the highest level, excuse me, to access the economic support that comes with it from central government. London faces stricter rules come Saturday, thanks to Mayor Sadiq Khan, who wants neither the economic packages that come with tier 3, nor apparently the civil liberties of tier 1. Boris Johnson is no longer following the signs, quite. Labour leader Keir Starmer wants another national lockdown in the form of a so-called circuit breaker, and most folk are just confused by the bewildering array of restrictions that now face them, depending on where they live. Let's go straight to our political editor, James Forsyth. James, it would seem to me that the government is now being pummeled on all sides.
Yeah, Andrew, I think you're right. I say in the magazine this week that Boris Johnson's gone from being a politician defined by his commitment to having his cake and eating it, to being one who's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. Take Keir Starmer adopting this sage proposal of a national circuit breaker. If Boris Johnson is currently not intending to go down that route, if the excess death numbers this winter are high, Keir Starmer will say, well, look, if you'd followed the scientific advice, they would be lower. But at the same time, Boris Johnson has to deal with the economic and societal damage of further lockdowns. And I think this is it is an almost impossible path to chart his way through. And I think what's very telling is how, in France, you've got Emmanuel Macron following a very similar strategy to Boris Johnson, of local lockdowns designed to avoid the catastrophe of a second national lockdown. And I think at the beginning of this week, when Keir Starmer went for it on the sage proposals and said, look, you should be going for the circuit breaker, I think there was a lot of concern in Downing Street. I think they think that if the gap between Boris Johnson and his own MPs, which was growing dangerously large because on the COVID restrictions, has been shortened by this, because they are happier arguing against the national circuit breaker, which is effectively a soft lockdown. And that Boris Johnson argument at Prime Minister's questions, why would you shut pubs in Cornwall when there's almost no COVID down there? That is something that the Tory benches can get behind.
So last week on the show, we talked to the Irish Times' Pat Leahy about how politicians there, they've separated from the scientists. Their equivalent of sage gave the Irish government advice about a strong lockdown. The Irish government said no. What we didn't know at the time was that was exactly what was happening in Britain, James. But it was happening in September, I think in the third week of September. We just didn't know about it.
The argument that has played out in this country is exactly the same as the argument that played out in Ireland, except in Ireland it played out in public, and here it played out behind closed doors. And I think what you see is scientists saying, go to circuit breaker, soft lockdown, whatever you want to call it, and the politicians saying, we can't do that because of the economic and social damage that will cause. And I think one of the things that is complicated in the situation is that in both the Irish cases and the British cases, I get the strong impression but the scientists knew that they are effectively involved in a negotiation. And so they're pitching for a maximalist position to try, because they know that the politicians are unlikely to do precisely what they say. I think one thing Boris Johnson needs to do, though, is be much clearer about why he's not following the science. I thought, in Ireland, you had the Deputy Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, be very explicit about why the coalition government there was not doing what the scientists were saying. Pointing out that he'd asked the scientists if they could guarantee that this circuit breaker would only be needed for 4 weeks, and they couldn't. And also saying, look, it's fine for these scientists to recommend more and more lockdowns. They're not at risk of losing their jobs. They're not going to have to lay people off. I think Boris Johnson needs a moment like that where he is explicit about why he's not following the scientists. He was discussed on Sunday, had a long discussion with Emmanuel Macron about COVID. Macron was very straight with the French people when schools went back. He said, look, the scientists do not recommend this, but I am doing this because I'm the president of the Republic, and I think this is more important. And I think Boris Johnson needs a moment where he says to the public, look, I'm not just going to do what Sage say, because I am the Prime Minister of the country and I've got to balance all of these factors. I think he needs to be explicit about that with the British people.
Let's go to Katie Bowles, our political correspondent. Katie, what's the political significance of Keir Starmer now putting clear blue water between Labour and the government on how to handle the COVID crisis?
Well, I think there are a few aspects to it. We now have that clear dividing line. There was a point, I think, in recent weeks where it was quite hard to actually differentiate Labour's position from the government's on coronavirus. Although Keir Starmer would huff and puff at the dispatch box, he would ultimately support a lot of the measures. And that was causing some anxiety amongst his own MPs. They wanted him to go for the government on this. So on the surface, I think that Keir Starmer's intervention has been well received in his own party. I also think it's worth remembering his own golden rule of opposition politics, which is only ask for things you think are actually going to happen. Keir Starmer takes the view that there's not much point calling on someone to resign if they're not going to, because you will look ineffective, as though your calls don't lead to much. So clearly there's a calculation in the leader's office that we are heading to a circuit breaker. As James touched on, it has had this effect of almost rallying the Tory party. Keir Starmer has somehow managed to almost unite the Tory party. Lockdown skeptics very annoyed at Boris Johnson, be it briefly, because there is a worse alternative. But I think there is a real risk for Boris Johnson, which is a lot of people in government and some in Downing Street think that we are still heading to something that looks a lot like a circuit breaker. I think there's some talk about rebranding a circuit breaker. So, you don't use that phrase, but ultimately it does look like a hopefully brief lockdown. And I think that if he ends up doing what Labour has called for, if he has to use Labour votes to get there, this brief, period of MPs backing him will go much worse than actually previous, and he's going to have a lot of problems in his own party. So we've still got to see the test of how it plays out. But I think that on the surface, this is okay for Boris Johnson, but if he actually ends up doing something like a circuit breaker, it's going to be very difficult for the Prime Minister.
Of course, in Northern Ireland, where there's a circuit breaker, it turns out to be 4 weeks, so it's not that short, is it? People talked about 2 weeks, but in Northern Ireland it's 4, which is not that different from a lockdown as we went into. James, what's the politics of this? I mean, the government's surrounded on all sides by its critics. It's kind of got to get this right, is it not? The course of action it's taken, it has to be right to dumbfound its critics. Otherwise, it's going to have to give in to its critics.
I think, as Katie said, this is a very dangerous moment for the government, because Boris Johnson is choosing to chart his own course. And I think if he is forced off that course and back to a national circuit breaker, one cabinet minister said to me last night, that would be absolutely the worst of all possible worlds for the government. There would have to be a vote in the House of Commons on it, and I think you would see a massive Tory rebellion. And obviously Keir Starmer, the Captain Hindsight jibe wouldn't work if Keir Starmer had called what Boris Johnson ended up doing in 2 or 3 weeks' time. And it's very interesting what you said about Northern Ireland, because I think it raises 2 crucial points, which is one, how long would this circuit break have to last for? And also, does it work if schools are still open? Now, we know that kind of primary age children don't spread the virus, but their parents take them to school, they congregate at the school gates and the like. And so I think the way the government sees us through it is a situation quite similar to March in the worst hit areas in the northwest and the northeast, but with schools open. I think the variation between the different parts of England is going to become much more intense in the coming week, and the restrictions are going to become much tighter in hotspots. And if you look at Andy Burnham today, you see the political problems that that is going to pose for the government. There's going to be lots of accusations that, you know, the north is being locked down while life continues as normal in the, or close to as normal in the south.
Let's bring in Fraser Nelson, the editor of The Spectator. Fraser, what's the mood in Downing Street? Is it gloomy? Is it a bit nervous that in some ways it could be seen to be out on a limb against the scientists, against Labour, sometimes against its own backbenchers, against the North, against London?
I'm not sure I'd say that. I mean, right now it feels as if the Prime Minister is step by step ending up in pretty much a national lockdown situation he said he wanted to avoid. We're in a situation now where I think the majority of this country would be breaking the law if you went to meet a friend for a drink. Now, you can call that a circuit breaker, you can say it's a series of tier 2 restrictions, but it feels pretty much like lockdown for those involved. And I think that what's happening is the Prime Minister has just lacked the ammunition to try to argue against the SAGE committee. They've been very, somebody in government said to me recently that the SAGE has become politically self-aware. It's been on a crash course of political dark arts, and it's now quite good at leaking papers to the press, getting the front page of the next day's paper, bouncing the government into a position. So the Prime Minister simply ends up outmaneuvered and bit by bit in exactly the position he promised he wouldn't go.
Indeed. Now, I'm saying that the government's surrounded by enemies on all sides, but perhaps not quite. Let's go to Ben Page from Ipsos MORI, because the fascinating thing is that public opinion is still actually very strongly for restrictions of the kind that the government has brought in. Indeed, some of them suggest that the government should go for even more restrictions than what Boris Johnson's introduced. Ben, I think you've got a slide, show some numbers. Talk us through public opinion.
Sure. So I don't know how I don't know if what we're going to see first, but basically what we can see is that about 6 out of 10 people have consistently said since May that we need to take whatever measures are necessary to control the virus at whatever cost. Okay, so here you can see the trend in the proportion of people just saying we need to do whatever's necessary. Back in May, it was 6 out of 10, 59%. In October, it's 6 out of 10 again, 62%. There's been a small rise since July who say that it's all doing more harm than good. But you've got to remember that at the same time, we've got by a margin of about 3 to 1, people saying that the current measures aren't strict enough. So there you are. Public opinion isn't really moving. Could I have the next slide, please? And so when you look at the measures up until the 3-tier system, 8 out of 10 people saying they favor compulsory masks, 3/4 are the quarantine, local lockdowns, 75%, the rule of 6, 65%, and even the young, interestingly, say they support the rule of 6. And the curfew at 10 o'clock tonight, in pubs and bars, again, there you are. The public are pretty consistent. If we look at more draconian measures, let's go on to what they might do next, please. You can see, again, not really much shift. You've got 6 out of 10 people in October saying we should just ban all travel in and out of the country. You're going to have to stay in France forever, Andrew. You're not going to be allowed back.
What a hardship.
And even another complete lockdown, people are divided over that. So you've got 40% opposed, but you've still got, it's 50-50 roughly, 43% in favor. I mean, it's quite astonishing in some ways, but people are very scared. And I think it's that unknown quantity of the risk involved. This is the challenge, that although, of course, most people know in their sort of logical brain that it's very unlikely to kill people under 30 and most people will catch it. In fact, we're finding in our work testing for it across the country that the vast majority of people who catch it don't even have any symptoms in the week before they test positive when we test at random in the population. But it's that unknown quantity about what might happen and the stories of young, healthy people catching it with unforeseen consequences. I think that's part of this, to be honest.
When you break down these figures, is it by demography, by age, do you work in the private sector, the public sector? Are you self-employed, or do you work for a company? Are there differences, variations there?
There are, but not anywhere near as much as you might expect. And even, among the young, you've got a quarter opposed to some of these measures. You can see in some regions of the country, it's 20%. So the regions that are in lockdown, opposition for local lockdowns goes up to 20%. But it's not, what I was surprised when I looked through the numbers before coming on to talk to you today was that you just we aren't seeing anywhere near as much variation as that we might see, for example, on who are you going to vote for, where as you know, there's a massive age gradient on political support. So no, it's across the piece. And yes, the self-employed who've had, in many ways, have been left short in terms of the support from the Treasury are more negative. But even there, the balance of opinion is in favour of the lockdowns.
James, let me come back to you on this, because that would suggest that those Tory backbenchers who've been critical of the government for doing too much on the lockdown side are actually not representative of public opinion.
Yeah, I think that is correct. But I think the problem for Boris Johnson is, I hope Ben will forgive me for quoting a number I saw from another pollster. 19% of the electorate think that the current restrictions go too far. The problem is for Boris Johnson is the vast majority of that 19% are Tory voters. Yeah. And this is the issue. For Keir Starmer in calling for a national circuit break is a fairly risk-free political option. Partly because, as Ben says, the public back it. And secondly, because the areas where the rates of COVID are very low are the southwest, the east of England, the southeast of England, where there are very few Labour seats. For example, in the southwest, the only Labour seat is Exeter, where there actually is a COVID problem because it's got a university. So the people who would be subject to extra restrictions if Keir Starmer went for the circuit break, don't vote Labour anyway, or they aren't Labour seats. While as I think it would be much in the north, I think there is a feeling that, this is a policy that is being, I'm sure, that is a policy that is being based on what is happening in London and the South, not here. Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, has been very strongly arguing that, the first lockdown was eased too early. It was eased on a London-centric timetable rather than a timetable that suited the North. And I think this is one of the big challenges for the government is this virus is so much more regional in this second wave than it was in this first wave. But it is much harder to generate a sense of national solidarity when people in Norfolk or Devon and Cornwall are living life almost as normal, while people in Liverpool and soon to be Manchester are facing really, really strict restrictions. Ben,
what does the polling tell us about the mood of the famous red wall voters, those usually Labour voters who in huge numbers in 29 voted Conservative, gave Mr. Johnson a seminal part of giving him his 80-seat majority? What do we know of their mood now?
Well, to be honest, the polls, both locally and nationally, haven't moved in any way as much as one might have expected, given how dramatic the situation is. I mean, the parties are neck and neck pretty much. So Keir Starmer has made up some ground. Boris Johnson's personal ratings and indeed the ratings of the government have now fallen quite markedly since April. But actually, it's worth remembering that back in the back end of last year, the rating of the government was only 18% satisfied. It was one of the lowest ratings for any government before the general election of December that Ipsos MORI had ever seen, because people were so fed up with the Brexit stalemate and everything else. And so even today, even after having disappointed people and confusion over lockdowns or not, and diver and delay and all of the rest of it, people believing that most people believe we went into lockdown too late. But even today, his satisfaction ratings are still much better than they were before the general election. So we need to bear that in mind. Under Ed Miliband at one point, Labour were 12 points ahead, and Mr. Starmer hasn't got anywhere near that yet.
Interesting. Okay, Ben, stick with us. We've been talking about the North. Let's speak to a Northern Conservative MP, Jake Berry. He represents Rosendale and Darwen, that's in Lancashire. Jake, first of all, tell us, what's it like in your constituency with COVID at the moment?
We're over 400 per 100,000. I represent 2 local authorities. It's a mixed picture, but both of them are high. But what you have to remember is, of course, Tier 2, which came in yesterday for my constituents, was a relaxation of the position we have been in since August. And during that Tier 2 style lockdown that we have had across large parts of the north of England since August, our rates have gone up tenfold. So I think there's a healthy spoonful of skepticism that tier 2 is going to work in Lancashire.
So are you saying then that the lockdown rules that you've had so far really haven't worked in controlling the virus?
Well, self-evidently they haven't, based on the number. Of course, we don't know what would have happened if we hadn't have had the tier 2 style lockdown since late summer. But what I would say is this, my impression is, and I disagree with quite a lot of that polling, because I think it gives people a false choice. People will always choose health over money. I think anyone with a brain would choose that. But when I go around Lancashire, I talk to people and talk to council leaders across Lancashire. The impression I get is very different, is that most people are simply ignoring everything that's being said in Westminster. They aren't really paying attention to tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. They've sort of made up their own mind how they're going to deal with this disease. They kind of comply with what they believe the rules are, but in truth, most people don't know or understand what the rules are. And it's not because we are thick or stupid in Lancashire, it's because they keep changing. And since August, I think across large parts of the north of England, we're now on our 19th or 20th different set of rules. So we have a sort of self-imposed and decided upon lockdown rules, which people are consistently following to try and keep themselves safe. But it's not, doesn't bear much resemblance to what the government wants us to do, in my experience.
Interesting. Is the government right to have gone this local lockdown route, to have different rules depending on the state of COVID in different regions or cities or so on? Or if we wanted, I saw you said to LBC, we need simple rules and a simple message. Well, rightly or wrongly, you could say that a national circuit breaker was that.
Well, look, the government is right to have imposed these national restrictions. Of course, we're talking about Rosendale and Darwin this evening. We'll be talking about Reading and Dagenham in just a couple of months' time, I'm sorry to say, or even a couple of weeks' time. So having a national system which people can understand and is simple is a country mile better than the confusing and sort of, mishmash of rules that we've had across the north of England. But crucially, and this is where the government has got it absolutely right this week, it needs to be turned on and off according to local data. And that's why actually I don't favour a national lockdown, but I would be pretty relaxed actually about a local circuit breaker in Lancashire, because in truth, we've been in tier 2 since August. It hasn't worked. So we need not to continue what we know doesn't work. I think we'd be up for trying something else. And a local lockdown across Lancashire, Manchester and Merseyside, based on their data, if that's what they want, I think would be the right thing to do from where we are today.
So who should have the responsibility for deciding to go into a local circuit breaker?
Well, I think it should be based on the data. I mean, if we based it on data, it wouldn't fall upon the government.
But who would take the decision?
Local council leaders. Well, I've called on the government to set out a clear gateway, both in and out of lockdown and these tiers, and also to publish information. It's a sort of, we're not telling people in Lancashire whether we're doing well or badly with what we're doing. This test and trace app, it cannot be beyond the wit of man to embed data in the test and trace app about how we are doing. If you visit any church hall across the country, they will probably have a thermometer on the wall telling you how near they're getting for their church roof appeal. We like targets. People like to know that what they're doing is working. So I think if you had a clear and fixed gateway where you came in and out of tiers, that the decision would be made by the data, not by local or national politicians.
Yeah, but data doesn't take decisions. Data informs decisions. I'm still not quite clear who would take the decision in the end. Would it be local government or would it be national government?
Well, it would have to be a combination of both. But if you said, for example, if your rate is over 400,000 per 100,000, your transmission rate is over X, or your hospitalisation rate is over Y, it would come to a point that you would then have local and national politicians saying, we have gone past the trigger point. Now is the time for us to implement tier 3 lockdown or a circuit breaker lockdown, whatever it may be. But at least the public would then not see this bickering between Northern Labour mayors and number 10 and ministers. They would say, well, actually, this is based on real science, real data that we can understand and we are part of. Therefore, we support the decision. I just don't think with the current state of decision making that I think we've lost the public, frankly, in many parts of the north of England.
Has the government therefore not handled the north well?
Well, I think it certainly could have handled the north better. I think our messaging has been poor. I think as I said, I think we've lost large parts of the public's attention in the north of England. It feels to me, funnily enough, a bit like Brexit felt, just as we were coming up towards the general election, that we were bickering about things in Parliament. And most people I spoke to went, well, we voted for it. We don't care how you do it. Just get on with it. When I talk to people across the north of England, they say, look, we don't want you bickering in Parliament about what's going on and whether we should listen to our mayor or council leader or government. We just want you to get on with tackling this disease. And that may be a completely unreasonable ask of the public. It's very, very difficult. But it sort of feels to me that that's where their opinion is. And that's a very dangerous moment for Parliament. And it's a very dangerous moment for these northern mayors, I think, as well.
Could be dangerous for your party too. I mean, the Conservative Party is now, to some extent, the party of the North since the December 2019 election. You're no longer just the party of the leafy home counties. Are you in danger with the way the government's going about this of losing the North?
Well, I think it's far too early to talk about losing the North, but there are 80 Northern MPs that we are literally the Prime Minister's majority, so he needs to look after us bluntly. But I also think Labour's in quite a lot of trouble with this as well, because what we are now seeing is a big division opening between the Labour mayors of the north of England, who are pushing the government, saying every single decision should be based on local data and on what local politicians think. And of course, Keir Starmer, who's calling for a national lockdown. That's all very well. It may be the right thing to do in parts of the north of England to have a circuit breaker. But what I don't want to see is when rates go up in Cornwall or in the south of England, for the north to be pushed into another national circuit breaker, just as our numbers have gone down and our economy is starting to recover. So yes, there is divisions within the Conservative Party, but I think that move by Keir Starmer this week was a bigger mistake than we yet realise, because it's creating big division both with him and his MPs in the north of England, who many of his MPs are campaigning to have a local approach. And of course, many of these mayors who are absolutely appearing on our TV channels every night saying it has to be a locally led approach. That's not what Keir's suggesting. And I think it's starting to cause him some trouble.
And yet Andy Burnham, the mayor of Manchester, and others seem to imply, or seem to say, take the position that they would rather have a national circuit breaker, as Mr. Starmer calls it, than being placed into a tier by central government. Are they right?
Well, I don't think they are. I don't think a national circuit breaker is the right way to go. I support many of the arguments Andy Burnham's made. Actually, I've supported them in the Commons about we have to have local data guiding these decisions. Why should Cornwall be put in lockdown now? Okay, that's bad for Cornwall now, but my real concern, as I've said, is in 2-3 months' time, I don't want my constituency put back into lockdown because they've got COVID in the south.
So let me just get you to sum up, Jake Berry. What should, take your constituency and the surrounding areas or areas in the north that have a similar number of COVID cases, what should the proper way ahead be as we sit here tonight for your area?
Okay, so the 3-tiered system has been in now just for 24 hours. The incubation period for this disease is 14 days. So we simply can't say whether this tier 2, tier 3 is going to work yet. So I think we have to give it at least 2 weeks. Although I say there is a large spoon of skepticism across the north of England, because we look at many of these restrictions, say, well, we've had them for over 2 months and they haven't worked. But I want to give the scientists and the computer models the benefit of the doubt. So let's give them a fortnight. If things haven't moved by then, if we are still seeing a rapid increase in growth rate of this disease and transmissibility within the community, I don't think there is any other choice for the government except to move to some form of circuit breaker based on local data. And I think it should be done on a county by county basis. So you would choose to do Lancashire, you may then choose to do Greater Manchester, Merseyside, maybe areas of West Yorkshire. And we go in and out of that circuit breaker based on local data. So Liverpool may be in it for a fortnight, Lancashire may be in it for 3 weeks, Greater Manchester in it for a month. So be it. But each one of those local circuit breakers has to be backed by proper government financial support. And that's really what we're looking to the Chancellor now to come forward, if we do go into that situation, to say how the government's going to support people and businesses throughout what will be a difficult and cold and miserable period in the winter.
You don't think the government's done enough, do you, on that front?
No, I think that we should be doing more. I've been quite clear that I think we should keep the 80% wage subsidy for those who are low paid. You can do that by guaranteeing 80% of the wages up to a different level. It's currently 66.6% up to 2,100. We of course could say, well, you know, the first 1,000 or the first 1,200 quid will guarantee 80%. But we're coming towards Christmas, and people who often work in the hospitality industry on low wages, you know, will be feeling the pinch already, hospitality having been shut down for much of the year. And I don't think it's unreasonable for them to say to the government, actually, we expect you to keep supporting our wages at 80%.
Jake Perry, thanks for that. Stay with us. There'll be some questions, I'm sure. Viewers at home, you can send your questions to SpectatorTV at spectator.co.uk. Let's move on to France and Islamic extremism. President Macron's in tray isn't just filled with pandemic response, so it certainly has a lot of that. There are curfews, proper curfews, not the pubs closing at 10, but actually off the streets, don't be out after 10 o'clock in 9 major French cities this week. But even so, in a recent speech, the president found time to draw up new battle lines in the fight against Islamic extremism in France. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a feminist activist, former Dutch politician, and she's written in this week's Spectator commending President Macron's speech that says he should go further. She joins me now. Ayaan, thank you for being with us. What is it that you liked about what President Macron had said?
Well, I loved it that he defined the problem as clearly as possible, because I think the failure of many Western leaders, at least as far back as 9/11, 2001, was they're euphemizing and obfuscating the problem and calling it anything but its real name. So I think it takes a great deal of courage for a leader on that level to come out and say, what we are facing is Islamist separatism. And so I think that's a first step. But then what follows out of that, you know, I'm a little skeptical, because I've had Angela Merkel declare that multiculturalism was dead. I've at one point even had David Cameron say he was going to take on these groups. And here in the United States of America, I've had President Trump say he was going to go after the ideological, not just jihad, the violent Islamists, but those who dedicate their time to poisoning and spreading these ideas. And we'll see. Well, we'll see what he does with it.
But what is meant by this word separatism? Can you just explain that? I mean, to my knowledge, French Muslims are not calling for a separate French Muslim state.
So the thing is, if you understand political Islam as a separate philosophy, and it is a philosophy that is confronting liberal societies and saying the liberal philosophies that Western societies are based on are corrupt, they're wrong, they have to be replaced with something else. What then these Islamists have done is they have taken advantage of the immigrant populations and convinced them, in the case of France, for instance, that they are in a nation state within a nation state. And so it's very clear, and I think it's the right thing for him to do, to confront these Islamists.
But what's the evidence that the vast majority or even a substantial minority of French Muslims are Islamists?
Well, there's a great deal of evidence for that that's been building up, and it's not just in France, it's in the UK, it's in other European countries, and it's here in America. The fact that there are Islamists, there's been plenty of evidence for that. You've had here in the UK, you've had.
But what about as a majority or even a substantial? No, there are, of course, you're quite right. There are Islamists in France, but what's the evidence that they represent even a substantial minority of the French Muslim community?
Substantial enough to plot terrorist attacks, substantial enough to refuse to learn the French language and live by French norms and French standards. There's a substantial evidence to show us that there is what I would say the white French would regard as an underclass of people who just refuse to be or are incapable of being assimilated into the wider French economy and society. And what, the question then is, why is that happening? And I think that not just the French, in this, we're using France as an example, but I think that immigration out of Muslim countries into Western society has, yes, brought a somewhat culture clash, but leaders have failed constantly, and they failed in 4 ways. They failed to make it very clear what Islamism is. They've allied with the wrong people. They have failed to regulate immigration, and there's been a failure by leadership to use the foreign tools or foreign policy tools to stop foreign countries from basically usurping the minorities, and look at a country like Turkey and what it's doing in France, what it's doing in Germany. There's been a failure to use foreign policy tools to stop these countries from financing Islamist ideology on European soil.
I know, Ayaan, we have to let you go shortly. Just two other quick questions. I mean, undoubtedly, there is an Islamic underclass in France. You see that in some of the suburbs of the biggest cities. They feel excluded. They are almost separate in some ways. But almost every Western country has an underclass like that. And it's not always Islamic. In Britain, you could see a white underclass has developed in cities, the city of Glasgow, your husband's city, for example. In many other parts of the West, you see a black underclass developed over many years, feeling excluded. I mean, given that most French immigrants are Muslim, that's what makes French immigration different from British or American or even German immigration. They're mainly Muslim. Was it not inevitable, and it may have nothing to do with Islam, that there is an Islamic underclass in France?
Yes, indeed. And I think one of the failures I mentioned is this failure to regulate immigration, give the Muslim communities that are already in France an opportunity to go through the process of integration or assimilation, as we call it here in the United States, and use the tools that a state has to make it very clear to those individuals and organizations that are turning people's minds away from what it is to be French and to assimilate, and instead brainwashing them into radical Islam. Those organizations and those individuals are groups that they shouldn't have partnered with, and for a long time they did. And for a long time, France, and it's not just France, but France has pretty much outsourced what they thought was the integration process to other countries. And I think they have to stop that. That is my piece in the
Spectator.
I think there's an awakening now. And I hope that Macron really means it, and that he isn't just saying these things to win the election in 2022, but that he's dedicated to really doing something about this problem and setting an example for the other European leaders.
Well, we shall see how he follows it up after this speech. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, thank you for writing your piece for The Spectator this week and for joining us from the Hoover Institution in California. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil.
Now, just to cheer you up, let's talk Brexit. The Brexit negotiations rumble on. Those doing the talking blow hot and cold at the prospect of a deal. The Prime Minister insisted there had to be one by mid-October. Well, by my calendar here on my computer, it's October the 15th. There's still no deal, but nobody's walking away yet. EU leaders, as we speak, are meeting for a summit in Brussels. They seem to like them. They've got one this week. James, let me go straight to you. Where are we? What's happening? What's going on?
So, Andrew, it's been a rather dramatic day today. We had European Council meeting, as you say. Then Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, had to leave it because a member of our outer office has tested positive for coronavirus. So she had to get out of the building quickly and go into isolation. We then had a rather punchy set of conclusions on Brexit issued by the European Union, essentially saying if there's going to be a deal, it's up to the UK to move, and essentially balls in your court. Then we had from David Frost, the UK's chief negotiator, a fairly robust response to that, saying it's a pretty bizarre approach to a negotiation to say that all the movement has to come from one side or the other. Michel Barnier has now come up to say that, yes, they do want to accelerate the talks, they do want to intensify them and speed them up. And I think in an attempt to say, look, the council conclusions are the council conclusions, but we don't want to carry on talking. So I think it is, and what we are essentially in right now is a game of chicken between the two sides. But neither side wants to back down. And, it is our old friends, fish and the level playing field, the really big issue. But I thought there was an interesting moment when Emmanuel Macron arrived at the council. He made his kind of usual doorstep remarks. And he said that he wouldn't accept French fishermen not continuing to have access to UK waters. Now that is interesting because I don't think anyone is talking about French fishermen not having access to UK waters. No. They're talking about them not having the same level of access, the same quota as they have at the moment. And I think that does indicate a certain possible flexibility from Macron. But I still think it is more likely than not that there'll be a deal. But I think there are a few twists in this tale to come.
And Fraser, you've been following these. You think a deal will still be done, and it's, look, it may end up this way. It's kind of inconceivable, though, is it not, that whether or not there's a deal should be determined by fish? I mean, people would just think, really? That's the real issue? You couldn't agree on that? And it may be difficult because the French position, I would suggest, Fraser, is it is indefensible. The French position at the moment is to say, well, it doesn't matter, you're leaving. We get the same access to these waters as we've always had. That's a political position. It's not a defensible position, is it?
No, and it'd be rather embarrassing for the government if it were to cede this point. The funny thing is that Boris and Macron are very close, perhaps one of the closest relationships in Europe right now. They text each other the whole time. And Macron has, he's several times, he said to his base in the north, there's no way I'm going to sell you out. Similarly, Michael Gove himself, the son of a fishmonger, said to the fishermen, don't worry, we're not going to sell you out. So one of these two will have to budge. And it wouldn't surprise me, actually, if it is Britain that budges. There was something about the drama of a few weeks ago with the internal market bill where they said they were going to tear up international law. And I thought to myself, I wonder if they're doing that in preparation for a concession further down the road, to basically sound really brave and hardline, to make it easier to offer the French that concession on fish. And my gut feeling is that we will end up with a deal. We'll get pretty much free trade. But it won't be a final deal. It will be one for revision. So if we, for example, were to give state aid to our companies, then the EU might change its regime. If we were to do a big free trade deal with a country the EU regarded as a competitor, it might change its regime. So this might be a process rather than an event. And the process is, I would say this is the end of it. I've got a horrible feeling this is about to be the beginning of something.
James, if there is to be a deal, some kind of deal, it may not be a very deep deal. And as Fraser says, it's a deal that will lend itself to being reopened depending on future actions down the road. What's the timetable now? We're on October the 15th. So when would we see a deal if there's going to be one?
So I think you would need to have clear progress by the end of the month, because that is when the EU's deadline for removing the contentious clauses in the internal market bill that seek to override the withdrawal agreement. And then I think you might have an agreement in the middle of November, and then a rush to ratify it in the European Parliament. And I think there's an interesting aspect here, which is I think both negotiating teams don't want to deal too early, because they have a fear that if a deal comes early, you will have EU member states seeking to unpick it. People saying, one of the coastal 8 might say, for example, we like this deal, but we'd like a little bit more on fish. Or, and I think this is the issue that, I think from the moment that Barnier and Frost, I would say shake hands, but they obviously won't be allowed to shake hands in the current situation. When Barnier and Frost initial the deal to ratification, they don't want any changes from that process on. So I think both sides wouldn't mind a fairly rapid ratification with no time to ask too many questions. Now, one of the issues there is when the European Parliament gets railroaded, it gets very sensitive and wants to assert itself. So that could be problematic. But ultimately, I think if they're, I think that all these deadlines keep moving to the right when it comes to Brexit. They always do. But I think, progress by the end of this month, deal then 2 weeks, say, to turn that into legal text. So deal on the 15th of November, say.
Okay, we shall see. We've got to get the American elections out of the way first as well. It's a busy time, and whether there's going to be local lockdowns or a national circuit breaker or whatever. Let's go straight to questions. First one's from Alan Simmons. He said, is it not time for everyone to take some of the financial burden? As a pensioner, I think the triple lock should be abandoned. He's referring to this triple lock, which guarantees, whether it's inflation or wages, that there is always a decent rise in state pensions every year. Katie, is that on the horizon as a way of raising some money or saving the government some money? Or does the Prime Minister feel, look, most of my votes come from the over 60s, it was a promise in the manifesto, we can't touch that?
I mean, I think if the Chancellor was a number 10, not number 11, the triple lock could be on the way out. But Boris Johnson is committed to it. And I think it's the target voter. It's been interesting. I mean, students have not been treated particularly well during this period, and 18 to 24-year-olds have never really been the key Tory target vote. So pensioners, I think, are seen as one that have to be kept on side. But also I think there's something else, which is Boris Johnson has a trust problem. His whole team are very aware of this. They're worried in their election campaign that untrustworthiness would be an issue for him. So I think to go back on a manifesto commitment, to go back on things like that is seen as something which come back to haunt him in many ways, which is why I think the triple lock does look as though it is going to stick around, despite the fact that our several high-profile figures in this government who have serious reservations about it when you're looking at about the burden going forward.
Right, I suspect it will survive simply for political reasons. You don't stuff your own voters is usually a way to proceed. Whether that's right or wrong is another matter. Keith Fair has a question. Why doesn't Mr. Johnson take the opportunity to put local politicians on the hook? Let them decide between jobs and health. What's wrong with that argument, Fraser?
Well, local politicians in this country have got very few powers. It's funny, the metro mayors are almost entirely tokenistic. Now, there is a case that, yes, you should give them finance powers, tax raising powers, and let them decide both sides of the equation, rather than simply say, yes, let's get restrictions on and please give us lots of welfare. But the architecture of the British government remains a very centralised architecture. So even though lots of people have been created in the regions to speak up for their locality, they don't really have the power. That's quite deliberate, and I don't think the Treasury or Number 10 is going to let go of that power anytime soon.
You agree with that, Jake Berry?
Well, I actually think it's what the government has attempted to do over the last 4 or 5 days or so. But these local politicians, they know that they don't want to make the decision in many cases. They don't want to carry the can for this. They would say, why should they? And they know that when the government contacts them, as they have been doing, say, you must make this decision, they can afford not to make the decision, let time tick by, and then, of course, the government has to come in and make it after all. And I think that is the how they are responding to Number 10 trying to hang them on the hook.
Is our politics changing, though, to more localism? I mean, it's always been, in modern times, it's always been the case. I'm speaking of England here, just of England, that in the end, central government had to bear the responsibility. So unlike America, where the central government was prepared to let New York go bust in the 1970s, because they knew in the end it was the New York politicians who would take the rap for it, even the Thatcher government was not prepared to let Liverpool go bust, because they knew that just the way we look at things, in the end, no matter how bad the Liverpool government had been, this central government would get the blame for one of our great cities going bust. Is that still basically the culture of our politics?
I think it is, but I think it's certainly changing. I mean, most people couldn't name their local authority leader, but they can, I would guess, most of the people who live in Greater Manchester or Liverpool or in South Yorkshire or the Tees Valley name their metro mayors. And of course, let's not forget that the stated policy of this government, in fact, set out by the Prime Minister in his first domestic policy speech when he entered number 10, is to have full mayoral devolution across the entirety of the north of England. When you get to that point, I think the relationship does change. And if we move a road I would love to see us go down, which Fraser mentioned, about sort of more fiscal devolution to these metro mayors so they can balance the scale. I mean, everyone likes Father Christmas, but occasionally he delivers a credit card bill in January. We need them to have responsibility for raising the money as well as spending it. And I think slowly, because these powers have to be ripped from the arms of civil servants and ministers in Whitehall. But I think slowly that is the direction of travel in our country.
Ron Knox has a question for you, Jake Berry. Can you explain why you chose Newark for extra funding in last year's Towns Fund for deprived areas? It just happened to be in Robert Jenrick's constituency. He, of course, being the Cabinet Minister for Local Government.
Well, Newark is a former mining town. So people who live there, I'm sure, think it's fantastic. But the Towns Fund is spent on a variety of towns, some of which are very deprived, some of which are in the mid-tier, but none of them, I can tell you, are wealthy. And I would ask your viewers to have a look at the NAO report on this very government policy, which had a deep look under the bonnet, said nothing to see, move on. And I think it's probably time we did.
But didn't you okay funding for his constituency, and then he okayed funding for your constituency? It sounds a little bit too close for comfort.
Well, I mean, you may say that it's following the ministerial code. You may disagree with the ministerial code, but it does seem right to me that that's the way it happens.
All right, Anthony Storm, has Keir Starmer's entry into the fray backfired on the Labour Party? I think, Anthony, it's probably too soon to say, but let me come to Ben here. Ben, if the Labour Party was to show success in rebuilding itself, what would you expect the polls to show in 2021? I mean, even putting COVID aside, would you not normally expect the opposition party to begin 2 years into government by next year, to begin to show some kind of decent lead in the polls?
Absolutely. And so far they haven't achieved that. And the Labour Party remains very unpopular. So Keir Starmer is now much more popular than his party with the electorate, but there seems to be, I mean, his front bench I think most voters would have great difficulty in naming any of them. And of course, the party itself is still seems quite damaged. So he's doing quite well on some personal characteristics against Boris Johnson, but it isn't translated into success. If he's vindicated over some of this, if this turns out to be a sort of massive moment where finally the accusations of incompetence stick on the government, and on some of these things, Starmer is doing better than Johnson. But if at that, and there's a huge death rate, the economy, massive recession, and finally Starmer starts to unveil some policies that seem attractive, then you might see it change. But so far, in a way, I've been surprised that Labour haven't managed to go into the lead, given the perils the government's faced and the difficulties they've got.
I agree. I'm a little bit surprised too, though. I suppose some Mr. Starmer's people in the Labour Party would say, you have no idea the ruin Jeremy Corbyn did to the Labour Party. And we can't build.
Pretty impressive.
We can't rebuild that overnight. for a long haul, as Mr. Kinnock found out, of course,
Yeah.
taking over from Michael Foot in '83. Alistair Dick has a question. James, I put it to you. Does the panel see a return to the fishing wars? I mean, for those of us who wrote about the cod war with Iceland, which I think, memory serves me right, we actually lost in the end. I mean, that would just be too good to be true, James, would it not, to get a great fish war going?
I think the most likely kind of fishing exchange, according to the government's own kind of contingency planning documents, is between English and French fishermen just off the coast. But because of the Channel Islands, UK territorial waters push up really quite close to French waters. So there are fishing communities in northern France that have, for generations, fished those waters. In the event of no deal, they would not be allowed to fish there anymore. And as we've seen with French fishermen in some previous exchanges in the Channel, they are not shy about, throwing anchors at other boats and all those kind of things. So things could get quite fruity there. And again, it's one of the reasons why I slightly suspect there's going to be a deal. There are so many problems in both the UK and France in dealing with COVID. Can you really add a scallop war to that list of issues?
Yeah, indeed. I now know why the government built these 2 aircraft carriers, though. that's how I don't think they'll be deployed on the Channel. Patricia Matthews has a question for you, Fraser. Is Boris Johnson too soft in the culture war? Should he be learning from Macron? I mean, maybe at the moment he just hasn't got time, Fraser.
Well, I'm afraid to say, I think the culture wars, it's a strange phrase, but it is one of the most important things. For a lot of young people, this is politics. He's hopeless on this. He's terrified of it. He runs away the Black Lives Matter protest where they were saying that Britain's a racist country. He couldn't even give a defense there. And Macron's speech he gave on Friday was absolute masterclass. He wasn't just being quite tough on Islamic hardliners. He was praising what he called the Enlightenment Islam. And he was drawing a clear distinction between the vast majority who are integrated French citizens and the jihadists who are trying to put people in separate ghettos. We've actually translated it into English and put it into the Spectator website. That's how much we liked Macron's speech. But Boris Johnson would rather run a million miles and just enter a discussion on any of this. And I think that's a great shame because it's a hugely powerful, potent force in politics right now. And I think the arguments are all there for the Tories to make.
Well, it was very different when he was doing your job, Fraser. There we go. He's sitting in a different seat now. We're going to leave it there now. It's just gone 7 o'clock. We thank you all for joining the Week in 60 Minutes. We'd love to find out what you thought of it, how we could improve on it. You can see our camera work is already getting better in London, not in mine yet. We're saving up to get me a better camera too. You can send any thoughts to SpectatorTV at spectator.co.uk. That's SpectatorTV at spectator.co.uk. If you liked it, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's a surefire way not to miss any future warnings because you click the button on the bottom right of your screen and you get a warning when the next edition is coming up. And before we go, of course, we'd like to thank all of our guests who are being with us from outside the Spectator, Jake Berry, Ben Page, and Ali, who had to go there, Katie Bowles, Fraser Nelson, and James Forsyth for the home team. Thanks to all of our guests, as I said, and a very special thanks to our sponsor, Charles Stanley. It's one of the UK's leading wealth management firms and one of the oldest companies on the London Stock Exchange. So it should know how to look after your money. We hope you'll join us again next Thursday at 6 p.m. London time for another The Week in 60 Minutes. Until then, bye-bye.